Ich freue mich, dass ich ein paar Gesichter sehe. Herzlich willkommen. Es
I think we should get started now. Warm welcome, everybody. It's still difficult in these times to make sure that everybody comes here in person, and some of you obviously made it, so I think this is worth a round of applause. It's simply a better feeling when you're up here on the stage to have participants in the room, to have them applaud. But I would also like to extend a warm welcome to all those who are joining us remotely. So welcome to the 2022 CDR Conference. You can also use the chat. You can enter your password, provided you have been registered with the conference for the live stream. Then you may also use the chat, and you're welcome to use it intensively so that you can join our discussion. And then we have the impression that there are thousands of participants in our conference. So once again, warm welcome to everybody, be it on your screen or here in the room. So some of you are here today, others are joining us via the live stream remotely. This is the digital method, and this is the future, as we all know, because digital transformation cannot be reversed. It's the way forward. And this is also the topic of our conference, that is digitalization, and in particular, digital responsibility, which is very important today also for businesses, of course, in order to prevent any adverse developments. We are living in times of major challenges, crisis, imbalances, transformation in all aspects of life. This is very stressful for many people, and this needs answers. And this is where corporate digital responsibility comes into play, because it's something to be applied by companies, and companies can act as multipliers, not only for their employees, but also for society as a whole. The CDR initiative was created back in 2018, and I have been involved in the initiative right from the beginning. And now, today, in fact, we will hear the first CDR reports from the companies involved, and we also want to talk about how to bring CDR forward. But first of all, I would like to welcome Dr. Christiane Rödleder, who's State Secretary in the Ministry for the Environment and Consumer Protection.
Heide, vielen Dank für die.
Ms. Heide, thank you very much indeed for your warm words of welcome. Thank you for moderating this conference today. Also, warm welcome to the participants in the room and those who are joining us remotely. I would like to thank all participants. In particular, of course, I would like to thank the representatives from those companies which are part of the CDR initiative, some of whom are represented here today. Under the new government, consumer protection was moved from the Ministry of Justice to the Ministry for the Environment and Consumer Protection, which is why we are responsible for consumer protection now. And in fact, over the last few months, we've had very interesting talks on this issue, and I met very interesting people from the CDR context. In times of uncertainty, the issue of corporate responsibility is more important than ever. The digital transformation harbors great opportunities for companies, allowing them to make things more efficient, also providing more tailor-made business models to their customers, and therefore it's all the more important for companies to use digitalization in a consumer-friendly and responsible manner. And therefore, it's good to see that so many companies responded to this call for corporate responsibility. In fact, some companies in the special times we live in have also provided support to refugees or assume responsibility in many other areas. Unfortunately, this is not true for all companies. There are also some businesses which now benefit enormously from the high prices resulting from the war, and this is not does definitely not serve what we call the common good. But I'm happy also that we do have the CDR initiative now aimed at promoting responsible corporate action in the digital sphere. Created in 2018, the initiative is designed to drive forward the concept of CDR proactively. Digital transformation brings fundamental change to our society, but apart from many positive aspects, there are also some negative trends. There's hate and hate speech, as well as fake news spreading like wildfire on the digital platforms. This is very stressful for the victims of people concerned, and it also has a deep impact on our democracies. In fact, this is also something I had to deal with in my previous capacity as state minister in the state of Rhineland-Palatinate, where we drew up an action plan to fight hate speech and xenophobia. What we see today is that our behavior is being tracked, our data is being collected. Companies create personality profiles in order to make us to consume ever more. There are artificial intelligence systems taking decisions which can be disadvantages or discriminatory against people. And such developments are particularly alarming when they are concentrated with individual companies, as we see it with the big tech companies in the United States. And this is why many years ago I campaigned for the GDPR to create a level playing field between European and non-European companies. Another important step, I believe, is the Digital Services Act as well as the Digital Markets Act adopted at the EU level recently, and creating a consumer-friendly framework for digital transformation. Even I think these acts could have gone even further. Then there's also the EU regulation on AI, which also has the potential for creating global standards to counter discrimination and to create a people-centered framework for this new technology. Apart from significant political projects, we also need a shift in paradigms in business. We must get away from the idea of making things higher, faster, further. We must prevent people from falling by the wayside. We do need technological progress, but the focus must be geared towards society. It must be centered on people. That is, we need business models really taking care of consumers' needs. So what we need is a digital transformation to the benefit of people and society. And this is what the CDR initiative is all about. The key to consumer-friendly digitalization is more transparency. If it is not possible to look into digital business models as we see it with the big tech companies and to understand how they function, it is impossible to prevent negative developments and to correct them. Transparency is what we need in order to create confidence and to have the possibility to have a democratic debate on the kind of digital change we want. And this is also the idea or objective of the CDR initiative, which was signed last year and which resulted in a CDR code committing all participants to provide annual reports on their CDR activities. And this is what the companies involved have done over recent months. They have gone to great lengths, and in these reports, they report report on measures in 5 fields of action in particular, that is data handling, education, climate and resource protection, employee involvement and inclusion. Today, these CDR reports will be presented to the public and they will also be available on the CDR initiative website. So this is why I'd like to extend my warmest thanks to all companies participating and for the hard work they have done. Thank you very much indeed for all the work you've put into CDR. And of course, I would also like to thank the academic support provided by the concerned company, which has also been involved in the CDR code. Today, we would also like to take a look at the interaction between digital transformation and sustainable transformation. It's like a twin challenge, and especially when we talk about the environment and then we talk about digitalization, that software, semiconductors, data flows on the one hand, trees and clean air on the other hand, but they're closely interrelated. They're really two sides of the same coin. Digital technologies can act as an instrument to address environmental issues in a very efficient manner. Mainframe computers can help us to monitor the climate, the same goes for satellite technology, which can help us to reduce the use of fertilizers, for instance. And it's this positive potential of digitalization that we want to use, that we want to tap, which is why the Ministry for the Environment has created what we call AI beacons for the environment, climate and nature. However, there's also a dark side to digitalization because digital technologies may also accelerate the climate crisis. 4% of all carbon emissions worldwide are caused by digital technologies. In addition, they make heavy use of natural resources. There's use of harmful cooling systems in data centers, for instance, and then there are the additional incentives to consume ever more, and that's why it's so important to make sure that digital transformation takes place in an environmentally sound manner and serves the common good. And this is where the companies have a role to play. Now, what we would like to talk about today is how to achieve digital transformation which serves the common good. We will also talk about the political framework that is needed. So I very much look forward to this conference and to lively discussions with you. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Frau Rohleder. Sie können gleich hier neben mir Platz nehmen.
Thank you, Ms. Rohleder. You may take your seat right here next to me. And I would like to ask the other panelists as well to join us here on the panel. Welcome to Lena Sophie Müller. She's Managing Director of the initiative D21. I'm also delighted to welcome Martin von Bruck. He is Chairman of the Board of the Wittenberg Center for Global Ethics.
Sie wissen es nicht, aber ich weiß, wer wo sitzen muss.
You don't know, but I know where each of you has to sit. Chairman of the Executive Board of Otto Group, Mr. Alexander Birken, is joining us virtually. Welcome. And Dr. Christian Lautermann, he's head of the research field, Enterprises, Value Chains and Consumption at the Institute for Ecological Economy Research. Welcome.
Frau Rohleder.
Ms. Rohleder, let's get started. You've just said that the CDR initiative was within the remit of the Federal Ministry of Justice before it's moved to the Federal Ministry for the Environment. So now it's in the Environment Ministry. Is there any significance for the initiative? Well, it doesn't really make any difference for the initiative itself. On the whole, we can say that the interplay between consumer protection and environmental protection allows us to strengthen the links between these two policy fields. So we can look at the possibility of strengthening the contributions between environmental protection and consumer protection and digitalization. And I think that this has been in the focus from the outset when the CDR initiative was launched. And of course, this link is very important to us. And I think the other areas are important as well. I have experience in the field of data, so I think that this is something that we really should look at. Before I became a state secretary, I worked in other areas, and the questions such as inclusion and equality have always been important.
Ja, genau, das sind Dinge, mit denen ich...
So these are things that I have been involved in, for example, when I was in the family ministry in Rhineland-Palatinate. So there are many issues that I really attach personal importance to. So all of these policy fields are linked here. This is a very comprehensive policy field. So the CDR initiative has been looking at all of these issues. Is the Environment Ministry the right body to look at these things? Well, I think it's not the right thing. I think that's consumer protection, which used to be in the remit of the Federal Justice Ministry. I think consumer protection has another responsibility, another task. I think we have to strike a balance, and this is difficult at times. Consumer protection requires rules to be observed. It's important to protect consumers, and it's important to say, now this is the limit. CDR has another function because it's about the individual responsibility of companies. It's about team play. It's about a joint approach to agreeing on certain targets. And it's about working together with the business sector on an equal footing. So I think the CDR initiative would have a better footing if it were able to operate more freely, more independently from the ministries. I think the CDR initiative has to evolve also in terms of the substance matter. And I think it would be able to do so if it were more independent. I think we'll be able to discuss these things now. Sustainability has been an important issue in Otto Group. Has the initiative changed your focus on this issue? Well, as you correctly say, sustainability has been an important issue for Otto Group for many years. It is a strategic objective for us. The more recent environment of the CDR context shows that this is a highly relevant issue, and we really want to make a difference here. So what has changed regarding the focus of the initiative? I would put it like this. We are all striving to evolve an understanding. We are sharing our knowledge, our expertise. We are trying to work on the correct solutions together, because in many areas there's no clear understanding of this topic. You say it's true, it's a very complex matter, and I think it's great that across society we're talking with governments, with NGOs, with companies to find common solutions together. As Elena Sophie has said, I think, to be honest, it's not only about consumer protection, it's not only about environmental protection, it's about designing societal processes and social responsibility. It's about shaping our lives. And in this regard, we are making a contribution to society, and a responsible contribution. I think it's good that this is not happening only in government, not only in the business sector, but across society. And in this regard, the CDR initiative has to strengthen this focus, and we have to learn from each other. So irrespective of where the initiative is located, this doesn't make a difference to you. I think if I look at a more abstract level, at the level of our social market economy, which I think is a great achievement, if we ask what's the role of the social market economy is in an age of digital transformation, I think sustainability has a new dimension, and we have to strengthen this, our responsibility. I think this is an important task for all of government, not for individual ministries. This is a very important and cross-cutting societal issue. Mr. van Broek, let's talk about the ethical perspective. What is digital corporate responsibility from an ethical perspective? I'll try to say that, to keep it short. I think it's important that companies promote trust in digital processes and do not undermine this trust. I think it's become clear in the light of the challenges of our times, which you mentioned at the outset. I think it's important that we work together and in a cooperative way with digital innovation. And it's important that people are able to trust these technologies. I think this is the context in which we are having these debates. We see digital disruptions, digital revolutions, and at the same time, there is often a lack of trust in these new technologies. So when we talk about CDR, we always talk about two levels. On the one hand, it's about harnessing the potential. It's about creating trust and offering positive narratives. And on the other hand, it is also important that that no legitimate interests are damaged. So when I trust data, when I offer data to others and trust algorithms, then there's also a risk involved in this. So I think it's always about doing both. We have to disrupt the current state of play, and we also have to find new limits. So there's both a motor and a brake that is required. So on the one hand, there's added value. On the other hand, there's the need to put a limit on the process. And what is really exciting is that companies have to play an important role here. Companies have to voluntarily limit certain processes in order to fulfill their responsibility. Mr. Lautermann, in terms of defining the concepts that we talk about here, what is digital sustainability for you? I think corporate digital responsibility is a concept that requires defining the concept of responsibility. Corporate responsibility means that responsible conduct involves protecting employees, respecting human rights. But there's also another dimension related to responsibility. For example, an awareness of being responsible. The challenge for companies is to establish some kind of digital responsibility culture within the company, and therefore digitalization is often linked to technological progress, but a more overarching ethical consideration is often missing. And this must take place at the level of individual employees. Responsibility and is also linked to being held accountable for what you do. So it is not always possible to, in all contexts, to bring companies to court, and therefore the concept of voluntary corporate responsibility, especially the concept of CSR, plays a role. And in the case of CDR, not all structures and mechanisms have been established, but there are established instruments such as reporting, which we are going to talk about today, help companies to take responsibility in the light of social debates. When we talk about implementing digital responsibility, I think from 100 largest companies, you've looked at 62 reports. So can we say that digital responsibility has been implemented in these companies? Well, yes, in individual cases, this is very interesting. There's a digital ethics officer or digital advisory panel which has been implemented in those companies. And Mr. Birken has said that these are the major issues of our time. Digital responsibility and sustainability are usually located at the strategic management level of companies. As you said, 62 out of the 100 largest German companies have made available these reports, and there's information on sustainability strategy, and responsibility strategy, but they're not always connected. And very often it's about efficiency questions, it's about competitiveness, about innovation, but it's not always about strategic sustainability considerations. On the operative level, on the operational level, there are other considerations, for example, production processes, Industry 4.0, energy conservation, and so on. So you've analyzed or taken a look at the current CDR reports. Do you see a difference there? So it's a kind of upgrade. Do you think this is a step in the right direction? Yes, definitely. This is a first step in the right direction. It's a pioneering work that is being done on this issue. But regarding the implementation, the operationalization and a nuanced approach to this issue, as we know it from the sustainability reporting, still has to evolve. But it sounds quite well, doesn't it? Mr. Lautmann has said that the first step has worked. Well, of course. I think it's great that companies are ready to voluntarily report on their activities in the field of CDR. In terms of sustainability reporting, the situation was similar. There were a few pioneers at the beginning, and then the trend evolved. Standardization and other requirements had to be met. I think it's very interesting. If you look at those reports, there are many different approaches and many different concepts. So shaping digital responsibility is linked to so many different things, and that is why there are so many approaches. So I think there's a possibility to learn from each other. I think this is a vital dimension here in this initiative. And I think this is definitely a benefit from the initiative. Being a member of this initiative, Ms. Birken, is one thing, but having to draw up a report on your activities is another, doesn't it? Well, I think in the business sector, you have to strike a balance. How much information do we provide to the public? Many companies think they shouldn't release all the information they have to the public. But we have, from our experience, I think it's been important to see that whenever we talk to NGOs about sustainability, or when we talk to federal ministries, that these are very valuable experiences, because we want to shape our society together. I want to talk about another aspect here. We usually divide the world between different sectors. There's the economy, the business sector, then there's society. But actually, we're all part of society. And whether we're talking about family-owned companies, about listed companies, what really matters is that we address the basic questions of society, that we harness the potential of digitalization and remain responsible at the same time. So this is something that I think is very important. So here at my company, we're willing to fully commit to this process. It's about learning from each other. Has something fundamental changed for the company from the CDR process? Well, yes and no. I think we have to make a difference here. The overall goal of CDR is to report on CDR initiatives. I think this is very comprehensive, and we also have best practices. So this is another dimension. Let me repeat what Ms. Rohleder has said. We want to share best practices. We have to talk about what is best. And often it's not about the big ideas, it's about small ideas. There are many ideas regarding corporate digital responsibility, and for example, when we look at the employees in our company, when we look at our staff, irrespective of the units they are working in, we want to engage them in a digital journey. We want to train them in digital affairs. So we also talk to education facilities. And what we're doing here is to make progress on digitalization also for society as a whole. So these are pioneers of a learning community.
Wie trägt das in die Gesellschaft rein? Reicht das?
What is the impact of this on society? This is a very important first step, and therefore it's good that we're now working on this issue. CDR is a topic which is being driven mainly by Germany. So there's corporate responsibility for digitalization because companies do play an important role in shaping society through their products. Mr. Birken has said that we should always try to think bigger, and this means that a new dynamism is unleashed, and there are pioneers who are shaping the digital transformation, the large tech companies from Asia, where different values are communicated. And I think it's important that we leave our comfort zone here in Germany and also in the European value context to talk to each other, and especially in the field of globally operating companies. The challenge is that they have to act locally. They have to address local challenges and observe local requirements. And at the same time, they have to implement this at a global level. So these are things that can be exchanged in a learning partnership, in a learning community. As a globally operating company, you can try to transport your values throughout the world, but you can also grow by learning from others. And so it's about leaving your comfort zone and learning from other contexts.
Yes, of course, it would be great if more companies were to join the initiative. And I'm always happy to see companies joining the initiative, and especially if the companies are pioneers, are trailblazers, and are not those who need to do some catching up. I mean, of course, they should also assume responsibility, certainly. But when you have companies searching your emails in order to customize their advertising, this is unacceptable. And this is something where I find it hard when the company then says, well, there are 2 or 3 things we'd like to do better. So the kind of companies we want to see in the initiative are those who take a holistic approach. So there's consumer protection on the one hand and responsibility on the other hand, isn't there? Well, but we are still very far from a situation where the big players play fair and where they are fair in terms of how they handle consumer data. So there is a lot of catching up to do. And when we ask the ethical question, it may well be that it may be of advantage or disadvantage to certain groups, but still, you know, that's where it's important for companies to assume responsibility and not to use everything they can to their economic benefit, things like evaluating personal emails. And that's why at EU level we have several regulations now. That's one thing. But if companies lived up to their responsibility, there wouldn't be need for such regulations in the first place. So we need the regulation in order to fill the gap. That's why there is the need for regulation, and the companies that need to be regulated aren't those I really want to explicitly invite to join the initiative, because they still have to do their homework before they are ready for it. Well, talking about the reports, there's a lot of information you can put into such reports, but how can they help to create confidence? Well, I think they need to address 3 issues. What are the values the company is based on, which means that they have to define their values. So you have the values, then you have the reality. There you also have to address certain conflicts which might be out there. You have the trade-off between freedom and self-determination. And thirdly, there is the issue of investment. In other words, what are companies doing in order to put the money where their mouth is? So there are clear requirements laid down in the CDR code, also on data handling, for instance, where there are restrictions on how data is being used. And again, you have the trade-off between exploiting personal data to the economic benefit, or does the company define certain conditions for using personal data and for taking people on board, or how do they allow consumers to have information on how the data is being used? So that's what is important with regard to reporting. How many times, how important are the sustainability reports? It's not the only foundation for creating confidence, is it? Well, I can't tell you how many times such reports are being downloaded, but I guess they're done. Happens more frequently than you might think, because society as a whole is changing. Looking at the younger generations, X, Y, Z, they attach much more importance to certain values, and also the practical implementation of values is much more important for them. And also what previous speakers said, you have the strategy on the one hand, but you also need to break down the strategy. We have a responsible commerce that inspires. That's our overall vision. And then we have a code of ethics, which wasn't drawn up by the management board, but which is the product of many stakeholders. And there are 8 criteria that have been laid down, and they apply to everybody, regardless of the sector you work in. And that's why we have this discourse within our company, within the entire group. And this may be painful sometimes because we have to talk about business with Russia, for instance, or Myanmar, where we have withdrawn now, because in terms of sustainability and the suppliers we came to the conclusion that they are so closely related to government, to the military in Myanmar, that we can no longer do business with them. So this may have economic impact, it may have business impact, and that's important. It's crucial to have this discourse within your company, whether you talk about sustainability or digitalization or whatever. And the issue of greenwashing or pinkwashing or whatever you may call it, companies will no longer get away with it because there's too much transparency now out there, and you have social media also disclosing information, and that's why it's important for companies to have such an open dialogue and to disclose this dialogue. So again, it's all about mutual learning. So mutual learning, partnership of learning, we've heard that before, but shouldn't that mean that more members should join the initiative? If we want to create confidence, the initiative should get bigger or more diverse. Would you agree with that? So you mean the more members, the more impact the initiative would have? Well, it depends. When it comes to illustrating best practices, for instance, if that's the focus, then we need strict conditions to be imposed, not by the companies themselves, but by non-biased parties. And that would indeed be my proposal as we move forward with sustainability reporting. I think it would be extremely desirable, well, indeed, to have more companies participating, but then it would mean that it's not just a platform for companies to show how great they are, but then it would also be a platform where comparisons can be made between companies, where bad things might be revealed. There's talk about European standards for sustainability reporting, and this would also be a way of making the CDR reporting operational, where the reports don't just talk about measures and activities, but also report on the output, where you might even have like performance indicators in order to enable comparisons between companies, something we don't have yet. So this might be the way forward. Wouldn't this also involve the issue of values, where we would need clear standards for certain values? Well, as far as values is concerned, I think the initiative has done a great job because it provides values, it provides certain standards, but the values need to be operationalized. As we've heard before, they must be put into practice. We have objectives laid down by the CDR code, but we have climate protection, science-based targets, what we call SMART targets or objectives. And for certain areas, it may well be that in the context of digitalization, we have similar targets, similar to what we have in the climate field, for instance, and also due diligence, something we have talk about with respect to supply chains, ethically correct behavior, ethical conduct, but there's also need for complaints management and how. And it's also important to look at how the complaints that are raised are handled by companies. State Secretary, is that maybe the area the CDR initiative should develop? Is this the direction it should take? Well, this is indeed something I would like to talk about with the members of the initiative. Taking the initiative forward, what I would like to see is more companies joining. When I said earlier, there are some big companies where I would rather be reluctant at the current stage to have them join the initiative. But having said that, at the same time, of course, I would be happy to see more companies joining the initiative to make it a broader-based initiative, and then we have to talk about further objectives jointly. Originally, the idea was to have a low threshold for joining the initiative because it needs extra efforts and work to be done by the companies. There also needs to be an added value for the companies, but also for society. I think that's the way we should take it forward. Mr. Berkan, we have a question from someone who's listening to the live stream. And as the State Secretary said, there is need for manpower and human resources to do this kind of reporting, and it may also involve financial means. How do you see that? Yes, indeed, that's a very good question. In our group, the Otto group, we have 2.5 billion turnover altogether. So we would talk about a really big company or group here where it's easier to have even centralized human resources, to have the kind of human resources you need. But interestingly enough, we have also smaller companies, 100 million euros turnover only. And here we see how can we take them on board. And we always find ways of doing it to also bring them on board. So that's important also. You may not have complete ESG reporting, 7, 8 fields of action that need to be covered, but you may identify 1 or 2 fields of action only. But as I said earlier, it's important to keep society as a whole in mind, which is why nobody can easily say, well, I'm not interested and I do not want to participate. Ms. Müller, CDR, it's still very much an issue which isn't well known, is it? Yes, that's true, and that's why we have to spread the message. I mean, it used to be the responsibility Ministry of Justice. Now it's responsibility Ministry for the Environment, Consumer Protection. But there are other authorities that need to be involved, other businesses, the Ministry for Infrastructure, for Transport, for Digitalization. They should also be involved because it's a huge trend we're talking about. Digital transformation concerns everybody, and that's why I fully share what the State Secretary said earlier. We need to motivate more companies to participate, and that's why it's important to have this ethical discourse and to keep ethical considerations in mind, to raise awareness for trade-offs, and also to spread the message to different business sectors. I think that's important at the federal policy level. But as we said last year at the CDR Conference, it's not an issue which can be addressed at the national level. It cannot be addressed by Germany alone. We need to take it to the European level or to the global level. We need like a global code of ethics. And that's why, as I said earlier, we need to think big. We have to get the message across that digitalization, it's really part of the mainstream, and it needs to be mainstreamed across all sectors, across all walks of life. Mr. Barker, Otto Group is a globally operating company. So how do you spread the message, so to speak? Well, we have this overall mission, which is also very much shareholder-driven in our group. So we do spread the message across the world, but the focus may differ from one area to another. Let's take the issue of diversity, for instance, which plays a much bigger role in the United States compared to Europe, for instance. But whenever we see good initiatives being developed in one country, and once they are made public, as we are doing with the CDR initiative, then others copy it and initiate the same measures or initiatives. And talking about CDR more specifically, we clearly need a European solution. Frankly speaking, I don't see a global solution. Again, looking at the United States, where you have where the system is much more based on capitalism, where you have different values. The same applies to Asia, where you have a centralized approach also towards business, towards the economy. So we have different values here in Europe, and I believe we share certain core values. And on the basis of these values, we should take things forward. And then we should say any company operating in Europe should respect the rules of the game in order to have a level playing field across the world. Now, again, how do we take this CDR issue to a bigger platform? How do we spread the message? It's important to keep the big picture in mind. When we talk about digital responsibility, we are talking about global supply chains, because we do not live on an island. And then we have to address the issue of how to deal with China, how to deal with the US, because we are all interrelated in terms of digitalization.
Auch einen eigenen Ansatz finden. Und ich meine, Europa steht ja.
So we need to make adjustments, we need investment, and Europe, geographically speaking, is in the middle somewhere. You have, but also in other respects, I believe Europe is in the middle. You have China with its highly centralized approach. You have the US on the other side, and we have the best of the two worlds, if you like, which puts us in a good position to take matters forward and to drive forward CDR, also creating added values. But again, we have to think big. And I still believe that the kind of initiative we have now is the first step and is a good step. And then we have to think it bigger, and we have to expand it, and we have to address the values, and then we have to look at specific investments. That is what needs to be invested in order to put the values into practice. State Secretary, how realistic is this to take it to the European level? Well, it depends how you want to shape the initiative. So far, it's been a completely voluntary exercise. My preference would be, for the time being, to keep the initiative at the national level and to broaden it in Germany, because we have only a few companies that have joined the initiative so far. So I think it would be good to broaden the initiative nationally first, and then in a next step, indeed, it might be a good idea to open the initiative to other European countries. Now, if I were to take an initiative or ask the European Commission to join the initiative, then I think it's more important to ask the Commission to come up with clear regulations to fill the regulatory gap, whereas we are talking about voluntary commitments, and that's why I see the risk that if we now focus on voluntary commitment, this might result in a situation where regulation might not be implemented. I mean, it's great to have such an initiative and voluntary commitments, but you may still have black sheep in certain markets, which is why there is also need for binding regulation. And since we can't do everything at the same time at the European level, I would prefer to place the emphasis on regulation in the strict sense of the term. Yes, I fully understand what you are saying. We shouldn't overburden the initiative. At the same time, the bigger the initiative becomes, the bigger the pressure, the peer pressure may become. So there we have regulation on the one hand, and you have voluntary commitments on the other hand. And if companies are reluctant to make voluntary commitments, the bigger the need for regulation. Having said that, if there are good initiatives out there, it would still be reasonable or beneficial, I think, to expand successful initiatives. If the initiative remains small, it won't be able to make a difference or much of a difference. So again, we should try to think big. And talking about Europe, as we saw with the German Act on Supply Chains, nice to have, certainly, but we need a European solution. We need European regulation. So I think the direction we should be heading for is clear. So how do you see it? Do you think we can or should put the CDR initiative at the European level? Yes, I think we do need European solutions. In Germany, we place a great emphasis on values. We are very much value-driven in Germany. At least that's the way I see it. But we must be careful not to distort competition. When we now have an act on supply chains and implemented, as we do or have been doing for quite some time in the Otto group, we must be careful that this doesn't result in competitive crowding out, because there's still many loopholes for international players in terms of data protection, but also tax compliance or non-compliance, rather, where there is a lot of imbalance, if not injustice. There's really tax injustice that needs to be addressed. It's another issue, but still. But the a CDR initiative, I believe it would have to be taken to the ESG reporting. This is where it should be integrated sooner or later, and necessarily this will or should happen and become part of the regulatory framework, but that it's something all players, all stakeholders should respect. Mr. Lautermann, looking ahead with respect to CDR reporting, where do you see the future? Well, as Mr. Buckinger said, I would be very much in favor of taking the CDR initiative forward. It started by some pioneers or visionaries, but it should be mainstreamed or should be integrated into other types of sustainability reporting. That's why we talk about what we call integrated reporting. Global progress reports, it's something we have seen before, and it has all been integrated now into the other kind of reporting. So the next important step for the initiative to take, even if it may be at the national level first only, but it's important now in a next step to take the code with its objectives and to put it into practice and to pave the way for standard setting. There is this European working group which deals with sustainability reporting. They haven't addressed CDR yet. That is, they had one small workshop on it, but it's something that needs to be addressed seriously at the European level. And I really look forward now to the specific CDR reports we will hear. The 500 reportable companies, 15,000 companies, but soon there will be 15,000 companies which have to comply with reporting requirements. So there are all kinds of standards now. So I think we shouldn't limit CDR to some nice brochures only. We're running short of time now, but one more question to you, Ms. Müller. Digital responsibility and CDR, how should it be addressed by companies? Should there be like chief ethical officers? Would that be a good step forward? At what level should CDR be dealt with by companies? Well, that's something we talked about earlier. And as I said earlier, too, I believe it's an issue which should be taken care of at management level. Digital transformation doesn't only have the ethical aspect, the aspect of responsibility, but digitalization is something which is crucial for every company to survive as a company in the future. So it's an issue which directly impacts any corporate strategy, and that's why it needs to be dealt with at the management level. So this would be my answer to your question. It's nothing which should be dealt with at lower levels. It should be dealt with by management at the management level. But it should still be a voluntary commitment only. Martin van Broek has this wonderful idea of saying, yes, there is regulation, there's the level of regulation, but there is the level of responsibility. And these levels should not be mixed because they're both equally important. If self-commitments do not work, then you need hard regulation. So it's about transformation, but it's also about innovation. There are areas we don't even know yet what kind of regulation we need because they are so innovative. That's why we need voluntary commitments too, to fill that gap. So we need both. We need voluntary commitments in partnership with businesses, and we need regulation. But we should see companies as a team, as team players, at the level of responsibility, and then we need the other level, the level of regulation. State Secretary, are we well prepared for this process, or are companies and regulators adequately prepared to take this process on? It's a huge challenge. All the challenges we are facing, we have the climate crisis, loss of biodiversity, pollution of our planet, the water, the air pollution, etc. There are so many challenges that need to be addressed at the same time. And at the same time, digitalization affects all these areas. We have scarcity of resources. We have so many areas that need to be addressed and that are all interrelated with digital transformation. So it's an enormous uphill struggle, which is why all stakeholders need to make a contribution if we want to tackle all these crises, and also if we want to ensure that digitalization will take place to the benefit of people, so that digitalization serves the common good and does not accelerate negative trends and developments. Also with regard to the resources needed by digitalization, I think that's something which we also need to raise awareness for. Now everybody's talking about higher energy costs, and so this issue is on the agenda now, but it should always be on the agenda. So we should always look at the overall picture if we want to address all the challenges we need to address. Well, there are so many other questions I would have liked to ask you, but we have no more time. So thank you very much to all panelists. Thank you for this very lively discussion. Many issues have not been addressed yet, but then there will be a second panel which might address these issues. But now we would like to show you a short film.
Who will shape our lives in the future? Human beings or machines? Thoughts or data? Creativity or code? Who will shape our lives in the future? The digital transformation is in need of new rules, but how can we shape digitalization to the benefit of everyone? How can we make sure that not just technology paves the way for the future, but that the potential of digitalization is harnessed to protect our climate, to remove barriers, to enable self-determination, and to design the digital world in a fair way? The Corporate Digital Responsibility Code is a tool that allows companies to assume responsibility for the digital transformation, ethical data handling, inclusion, climate action. In annual CDR reports, they inform about their activities and best practices. The goal is to put people at the center of digital transformation. Their promise is to enable digitalization with responsibility. Find out everything about the CDR initiative under cdr-initiative.de. We will also be looking at concrete examples from practice in a minute, companies that are active in this initiative and in this way fulfill their responsibility in the CDR context. And there's also scientific consultancy for the CDR initiative, and we would like to talk to those who have accompanied this process. I'd like to introduce Dr. Christian Thurn from Coon Policy, who's joining us online. I'd like to welcome Dr. Alexander Brink from the University of Bayreuth and Dr. Frank Esselmann, also from Concern. Mr. Torun. So the other two are still taking their seats. Maybe we can start, Mr. Torun. Can you explain why the code and why the reporting requirement have been established? Well, we have to look back at the year 2018 when the CDR initiative was launched. The situation back then was that many said that companies have to take responsibility in the digital transformation, but nobody really had a clear answer for what this actually meant. So what does it mean to assume responsibility in the digital context? It's just been said that the issues were not as clear back then compared to other policy fields such as human rights or environment. So this is the reason why all members of the initiative knew that there was a need for a code that could provide guidance and define what responsibility means in the digital context. So the 5 fields of action were established and concrete measures for taking action. The code was presented at the last CDR conference. So you've got the code, but why is there the reporting requirement? Well, at the same time, a code is just paper. And we've learned from the discussion here that what really matters is concrete action. And therefore, the reports were designed to create transparency on how CDR can be implemented in practice, so that a common learning structure can be created. It is a possibility to learn about what companies are doing to fulfill their digital responsibility. And the second objective of the reporting requirement was to create a more binding mechanism. The idea was that companies could be held accountable to for what they were doing. And companies also want to compare themselves and with each other. So the idea was to create a more binding mechanism, common learning, and a more binding mechanism. So what was the structure of the code? Well, there's the attempt to strike a balance between theory and practice. Responsibility is a very big term. We've heard the first panel that general values are covered by the term responsibility, but it's also about assuming responsibility. And what we did with the code is we defined key principles. The human-centered approach, transparency, self-determination are all part of the concept. And interestingly, the companies also showed that these values were very important because they form the compass for digital conduct. And then as a second step, we further defined the areas in which companies were to assume responsibility, for example, climate action and data handling. What we then did is that we defined concrete targets. These targets were set out, and this was the second level. The third level was the reporting that took place by the companies. And I'm sure we will be looking at a few examples in a minute. So this relationship between principles, fields of action, and measures is an attempt to strike the balance between theory and practice. So codes of ethics, codes of conduct, and are to manage this transition from theory to practice. I think it's managed quite well, and of course it's just a first step. I think we can be proud, however, of what we have achieved. In the first panel, we said that this is a learning partnership. What can you say about this? Well, first of all, everyone who reads these reports will see that these are very comprehensive assessments. They are lengthy reports, and they have comprehensive information. You will find a lot about the fields of action, about joint fields of action, joint strategies. And we think it's very great that information is released that wouldn't actually be published otherwise. So this is really valuable information. These are internal mechanisms, for example, of how CDR is implemented in the company. And then you can also see certain specifics regarding the corporate culture and the values of company. I think this is an important element of these reports because the digital world is so diverse and you don't often understand the differences between the companies. However, these reports allow you to understand what values a company adheres to and the diversity that is reflected in a company and all sorts of information. What are the limits? I think the limits are largely defined by the fact that a report cannot be exhaustive. So a single report cannot formulate all the measures taken by a company. I think this is a natural limit to the reporting. Then, you see, digitalization is a very technical issue. And some of the measures that are described, or many of them are excellent measures, are not understandable to everyone. I think this is a technical challenge, and it's also an objective of the initiative to communicate this information to the public. Mr. Thoron, you've raised your hand. I suppose you would like to add something here. But you have to put your mic on. The mic should be on. Okay. So what I think is very important here, and it has been talked about in the previous discussion, when we talk about CDR, you shouldn't have the impression that it's only about the CDR discussion. CDR is part of an entire corporate responsibility debate. So this is an additional perspective, and it has been talked about here. We have to think about how this can contribute to sustainability reporting. So this is a first step, but we have to think about how the process can be integrated into the general reporting mechanisms. And also, I think it's important to see that we shouldn't be complacent about our reports. Reports are there to change something in reality. And the individual departments of a company have different approaches and different interests. But therefore, this defines a limit of the reports, because the reports have to look at the practical implementation of CDR. So the idea is to be able to compare different companies on what they're doing. So we really have to look close at practice. Mr. Brink, last question to you. I think Mr. Birken from Otto Group has said that when you write such a report, the feeling is that you have to publish everything about your company. It's not often a comfortable feeling. Well, Mr. Birken has highlighted that this is not compulsory reporting mechanism. Companies can set their own priorities. Individual measures can be strengthened. And I think that from a scientific perspective, the effect of the reporting mechanism is very important, because the entire staff has to contribute here, and the awareness is raised. So this is the entire corporate spirit, right? Yes. So now we will look at the insights into the CDR reports from the companies themselves, and we'll start with Zalando.
Mal schauen, ob es klappt.
Let's see if it works.
So, ich hoffe, Sie können uns hören.
I hope you can hear us and see us.
So, Zalando ist da.
Oh, Zalando's right here. Sorry, I was waiting for a trigger. I was waiting for a video. Please, I do apologize. So, actually, there should be slides right now. Can you use this button? Okay, excellent. In our company, I'm responsible for data protection and technology legislation. So everything that is related to data falls under my responsibility. Zalando is a technology company, and therefore our digital responsibility is something we take very seriously. CDR is part of our DNA, and it's a natural part of our corporate culture. It is not just related to individual measures or targets. It's about the entire approach to CDR. CDR is an addition to other instruments we have in our company, for example, privacy principle, and these mechanisms work in a similar way. The measures are different in scope and organization. There are individual measures. There are also organizational measures to activate CDR across the company. So this is very important for us. Privacy is a holistic concept in our company, and the CDR goals are handled in the same process. There are interfaces we deal with privacy coordinators. These can be developers that are trained in privacy, and they are also trained in CDR aspects. So this is part of their privacy training. So this is something we do on site, and then privacy is also part of the development process. So CDR objectives are to be taken into account in the production phase and not just at the end. And we are using these interface processes. We are closely watching the production process to take CDR aspects into account, and in this way we are able to implement CDR. CDR targets can also be implemented in other ways. Fairness, algorithms, machine learning are important issues for us. So there are decentralized learning groups where colleagues get together to evaluate current research findings, and they do this together with external researchers from universities. So this is to enhance the knowledge and the expertise on these issues, and colleagues are to learn something about these new issues, and in this way they are motivated to bring these aspects into the development process. Thank you.
Dann geht's jetzt weiter mit der
So now, let's move on to ING.
Ja, guten Tag, meine Damen und Herren. Mein Name ist Thomas Bieler.
Good morning. My name is Thomas Bieler. I'm the Consumer Protection Officer of ING Germany, and I also coordinate the CDR issue in my company. Since 2019, I've been part of the chief CDR unit. Why are we working on the CDR issue? We are a direct bank, and our business model is to provide bank services at a low cost without bank offices. Digitalization plays a key role here, of course, and this also concerns our internal procedures. But of course, technology is not everything. We know that humans have to be at the center, and this has been said before. It is only by getting the trust of our customers and our employees that we can be successful. Trust is vital, and therefore CDR is an important thing to consider. We must be able to communicate clearly and also to show in this report that we take CDR seriously, and this has been talked about before. We do this for our staff. For example, we describe this in our report in the field of education. You can see this on the slide. I would like to place this under 3 headings. The first thing is we want to train our staff. We train them in our digital sessions. There are learning spaces about digitalization. So we talk about issues such as ethical data analysis, digital data, and other issues as well. So these are events between 30 to 90 minutes, and in these sessions our employees are trained. There are also external training measures. There's a learning budget of €500 per year, which allows you to join a course. The second pillar is raising awareness. So this is not just about imparting knowledge. It's about training digital skills. And we think that ethical handling of data is very important. And there are also compulsory mechanisms here. Legal but harmful is a buzzword here. So this means that there's an area where it's legal to do certain things, but we know that it may be harmful to our customers or to the bank. So here we want to raise awareness. The last area is what I call bringing the process further. And here, the digitalization of work life and of professional careers is where we provide coaching and programs such as the Smart Movers program. And this program allows people from all walks of life to get trained in information technology. And if they see that maybe this is not their cup of tea, then they can get back to their old job without having any disadvantages. So this is about our responsibility in the field of education. Let me now talk about our responsibility in the field of environment, and I will move to our colleague. Can you hear us? We can see you. And hopefully we'll be able to hear you as well. Okay, yes, it's working. I'm the Compliance Management Officer. I'm a Corporate Responsibility Manager from Deutsche Telekom AG, and we are a telecommunications company. And of course, digital responsibility is very important for our business culture. The digital transformation in society is getting very fast. Climate action, social inequalities, but also digital divides and digital progress are challenges that affect everyone in both positive and negative ways. And we have set ourselves the target to address these challenges. We as a society have to master this challenge, and therefore being part of this digital world is so important. It is so important, and therefore we want to allow people to have part in this digital world. We at Telekom oblige our suppliers and business partners to observe these requirements. It's very difficult to understand the speaker. We are convinced that technological development has to meet the ethical requirements. And we put people first. Corporate digital responsibility is important for us at Deutsche Telekom, and as a concrete example of a measure in our company, let's mention the initiative of a green network. An efficient network structure is very important. Today, our customers are using a green electricity-powered network. And this also concerns the devices linked to the grid. But of course, energy consumption should not rise. So we want to make the process very efficient. By 2024, we want to double our network efficiency. This means that we manage all of our systems consistently, and we operate the networks by integrating wind and solar energy. Another key element is to manage and recycle waste. Sound quality is not understandable. We want to define and pursue common goals and strategies. Digitalization also offers new possibilities, new prospects. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me? I'm Corporate Responsibility Officer, Telefonica Germany. So we've got the CDR report. It's been very interesting to draft this report. Corporate digital responsibility is something we look at across all departments. And the code is a guidance for our actions and activities. We want to design digitalization sustainably and responsibly. We want to make progress on digitalization in society. Digitalization is intended to serve the people. It's not the other way around. And Deutsche Telekom has also said that people remain at the forefront of the digital process. Many issues are part of this. For example, transparency, sustainable communication. And I would like to describe digital inclusion further. We support making available the opportunities of digitalization to everyone. I hope you can also see the slide.
Produkten und Dienstleistungen entgegenzuwirken. Und das machen wir ganz besonders und mit vollem Herzen für unsere Senioren und Seniorinnen.
We want to enhance access to digital services for elderly people. We want to increase digital opportunities, and it's not easy for many older people to understand and get access to the digital world. They have to learn new things and new skills, and this is not easy for them. We support them. We provide tablets, devices. We offer showrooms and training sessions, and allow them to get access to this issue. There are also other services that we offer to everyone. There are also services for beginners. So the idea is to enhance access to the digital world. Another important goal is to support participation. We've got a digital package for schools, and we developed this program to promote digitalization in schools. We offer devices to teachers, and the service employees accompany the teachers in using those devices. So, as I said, we provide devices to conferences, for example. We want to enhance people's skills on using the internet responsibly. And finally, there are also initiatives that we use to also enter into a dialogue with the CDR initiative. Let me now pass the floor to a colleague from Barmer who's going to talk about the last field of action.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Maria Hinz, digital coordinator for Barmer. That's a health insurance company in Germany. For us, digitalization is very important. We want to provide digital services to our customers, and when it comes to health and health data in particular, ethical issues are very important, which is why we have taken CDR on board very early on. But to push forward with digitalization, employers must be trained, they must be taken on board so that we can push and drive forward digitalization together. So you need to actively involve employees in decision-making process. You have to provide them with the tools to use digital means and to explain how it can be used to the benefit of our customers. So I would like to show you a few slides. Here you can see different pairs of shoes, because the idea is that you need to adapt and adjust in order to wear different types of shoes. So for that purpose, we have different programs. We have what we call cultural journeys. We have a POP, or product owner program, in order to improve design thinking, to enable employees to translate training into their everyday work. So you need a lot of understanding in terms of digitalization if you want to really apply it at all levels in your companies. And that's why we have what we call cultural journeys, both internally and externally. And the focus here is on digital know-how, digital competences to make clear to all employees what it means to provide digital services. So we really want to sparkle this enthusiasm and pass it on to our customers. And that's why we put in place 600 digi-coaches, as we call them. These are multipliers who see eye to eye with other employees and who are contact persons whenever there are questions concerning digital matters. So in order to address any open questions very early. So here we have some of our 600 digi-coaches. They work at all level, case processing, customer contact, and as you can see, the very friendly staff, full of enthusiasm. And this brings me to the end of my presentation. And thank you. Now, it took quite some years to come up with the CDR code. How long did your report take? Well, I spent quite a few weeks, if not months, really. I talked to many employees at all levels in all sections of our company. And fortunately, I heard about many interesting measures that there's a lot of action which bears the idea of responsibility in mind. So it's been worth it, certainly. And also my going around was helpful because it pushed the issue internally, and now we have the report, which will send an external message. So we put a lot of work into it, but I think it's definitely been worth it. Where did you get that great necklace from? I am not allowed to do any advertising here. Thank you so much. So we've heard really a variety of measures from different types of companies. Now, what about Zalando? Do you also think it's worth it addressing the CDR issue? Well, for us, it's like a parenthesis. CDR is something you have to address anyhow. And CDR is a kind of heading which allows you to bring things together, and it's not an end in itself, especially when you operate in the B2C area where you have direct contact with customers. We're also talking about customers' trust. This is the very basis of our business. We need the trust of our consumers. We need to concerns that may be out there. Customers may be reluctant to share their data, and this is crucial in the digital sphere where you need to create trust and confidence, and that's where CDR can be helpful. And also the comments we heard before. I think every company needs to see what they can do. Is it a big company? Fine, they can do many things. If you have a smaller company, they still can do something, even if they limit their action to specific areas. This brings me to the next question. And this is a good reason, actually, for participating in the CDR initiative. But now, to you again specifically, when do you think the objective will have been achieved? I don't think it will ever be achieved because the objective will continue to evolve. But the CDR for us, it's like an umbrella under which other things take place, which were maybe in existence before, but now we do have this term, we have the concept of CDR. This is helpful. We want to be digital leaders, and we also want to be leaders in terms of responsibility. And now we are the only bank which has done so. But CDR was also helpful in terms of internal processes. I had to coordinate with 12 sections or departments within our bank, but this also helped to raise awareness among employees, so inside our bank, and to mainstream it in everyday work. So this has been helpful, and everybody really embraced CDR and the issue, and the fact that we were able to take everybody on board, I think, shows how important it is and how successful you can be. What about Deutsche Telekom? What impact did your CDR report had? Telekom had joined the initiative right from the beginning. Well, it's a journey. We really embarked on a journey here, but the good thing was to have this interaction. We had this process of talking about things, then putting it together in a report involving many employees, and this really triggered a dialogue and helps us to drive the issue forward with new ideas, new products. So it also helped in terms of employee involvement and inclusion, but also looking at the management level. Board members of the management board have also become aware of the issue. Thank you. What about you, Melanie? What challenges did you encounter when drawing up the report? Well, sustainability reports, that's something we have been doing for quite some time. The CDR report, that's been a first. And there was the time issue, of course, because we also have to produce the ESGD reports. We had to liaise with data protection officers. So it's been a learning process. I think we really learned many lessons in writing or preparing the report, but I do look forward to the next round, and the reporting also helped us to make the CDR code more popular and better known. Thank you. Thank you very much for this first-hand experience from people on the ground in the companies involved. I think this also deserves a round of applause. So it's great to have the will and commitment by companies. That's one thing. That's very important, of course. But in addition to that, what is also important are the political and social framework conditions. And that's what we would like to talk about in our next panel. That is, what political and social conditions do we need? It's something we briefly touched upon already during the first panel, but now we'd like to take a deep dive, and that's why I'd like to welcome Christian Coon, Parliamentary State Secretary at the Ministry for the Environment and Consumer Protection. Hello, thanks for having me. There's one panelist missing. She became sick, unfortunately. That's Birgit Ries. And others are not here in person, but are also joining us virtually. Jakob Wössner, for instance, Manager for Organizational Development and Digital Transformation from the Vilida company. Then let me welcome Professor Dr. Anna Trittin-Ulbrich, Professor of Business Ethics at the Leuphana University of Lüneburg. And then there's Nicola Brand, Dr. Nicola Brand. She's Director of the Oecd Center here in Berlin. Welcome, everybody. Professor Trittin, we would like to start by defining what we're talking about. In the first panel, we talked about trust and responsibility. Now we would like to talk about sustainable digitalization. What does it mean, this concept, sustainable digitalization? Well, we can make reference to other terms, triple bottom line, for instance, digitalization, together with sustainability or sustainable digitalization. For me, this means that economic, societal, and environmental considerations are taken into account, be it with regard to collecting data, processing data, or be it with respect to digital innovation. So it's important always to bear economic and environmental considerations in mind, also to anticipate them, and also to fully harness economic and environmental opportunities for society. Dr. Brandt, are you happy with that definition? It's a rather broad definition. However, the difficulty when you take such a broad approach and look at how it can serve the common good, this tends to make things very difficult, or you end up with high-level principles such as sustainability, environmentally friendly, all those buzzwords. What I would like to add, speaking from the OECD perspective, is to maybe make it more operational and to set some kind of standard. There are the OECD guidelines for multinational companies. They date back to the 70s, by the way. So they were created at a time when nobody was talking about digitalization because it didn't even exist yet. But they also contain important principles. These OECD guidelines, respect of human rights, for instance, compliance with human rights, that would be a social aspect, but also the idea of acting to the benefit of people, the benefit of the planet as a whole, the idea of social justice, but also environmental sustainability. And then, but it also contains the idea of anti-corruption, avoidance of tax evasion, or prevention of tax avoidance and tax evasion that was mentioned before. I believe Mr. Birkin mentioned that. There is what we call tax avoidance. This may still be legal, but it is still harmful, and it's something which can be done very easily by multinationals operating digitally. So all these things have already been covered by our OECD standards at the very high level, if you like, or generic level. So the idea is for companies to create benefit to society and to prevent damage. Now, these OECD guidelines have been adjusted over the decades and have been brought up to date, and they are really in compliance, very concurrent now with the CDR guidelines. They, in fact, artificial intelligence guidelines have been added now. This has been subscribed by OECD countries, but many other countries, also in Latin America, other parts of the world. So again, the same idea of businesses having to create benefit to the people and to society as a whole. So this is very much in line with the CDR principles. Again, respect of human rights, promotion of democracy, diversity, transparency, and also traceability. I mean, we have what we call the digital divide, where people don't have the same digital know-how. So you have the idea of digital inclusion, but also robustness, safety and security, especially with respect to AI, where you need the assurance of safety. And so this is where the CDR reporting comes in, where now companies can show that they comply with such standards. And it's great, I think, to have tangible results, as we have seen. State Secretary, Now, looking at the political level or social level, and again, the term sustainable digitalization, and we've heard about guidelines which have been in place even since the 70s for multinationals. That is the OECD guidelines. We have AI guidelines. We have the CDR initiatives. So there's a lot of action. But what does it mean in practice? Well, I would say we're right in the middle. Digital transformation is such a broad process that covers so many things and affects so many people, and it's a very rapid process where new technologies mushroom and spread, such as artificial intelligence, for instance. And so our objective is to get it right, to make it sustainable, to ensure sustainable digitalization. And, well, the CDR initiative is a voluntary commitment. It is people-centered. It takes environmental concerns into consideration. So I don't think we are at the beginning or we're at the end. We're right in the middle of this process. Now, your company, that's the Vilida company, has lived up to its responsibility. You're a natural cosmetics company, so you have always subscribed to sustainability. But what brought you to corporate digital responsibility? When did this process start? Our CDR process started 4 years ago. That is in 2018. There was the Digital Summit where we discussed how we want to use digitalization for our company. So this was a deliberate process. We didn't simply embrace digitalization as such in terms of new technology, but we realized or came to the understanding that digitalization has really a broad impact on everybody, on society as a whole. So it's something we need to take on board. Digitalization brings up new issues, raises new challenges, and that's why we soon realized that we need to take a stance here in order to uphold our values and our long-standing tradition of sustainability so that we can really identify and embrace the kind of digitalization we want to apply. So this is how we came to CDR, and since we have the sustainability know-how in our DNA, we have the knowledge that was needed. We identified targets, but we also applied them across the board in our company. That is, any new principles or any new measures are tested against our principles, against our values. So it's not just a superficial exercise, but it's really an overarching value-based, value-driven process. So this is the objective we have, and that's why we said we do need CDR in order to stay credible, but also in order to embrace technological progress. In our first panel, Mr. Lauterbahn said that as from 2024, there will be the sustainability reporting requirement by the European Union. This requirement will apply. What impact do you think will this have?
Ja, ich habe nur nicht gehört, dass die Frage.
Mr. Coon, can you hear us? Let me ask the question again. So in 2024, there will be the EU's sustainability reporting requirement. Will this change the overall parameters? Of course. I can hear a very strong echo. I hope you can hear me. I'm sure it will change the parameters of the process. So there's a general framework from the EU to shape digitalization, and it's important to look at all the aspects related to this. So the EU is pioneering the effort to legislate this, and we at the Consumer Protection Ministry are supporting this effort. We're trying to make sure that the criteria that are established take into account diversity criteria, consumer protection, consumer interests, and this is very important. And we will continue to support this effort to make sure that transparency is delivered. And there are initiatives such as the CDR initiatives and others that can help us to make this process tangible. So the EU's framework will, I hope, become a standard that will be internationally recognized. And here in this field, the EU can play a very important role in setting a standard for sustainable digitalization. So what is your stance on this? Do you think that European legislation is key here, or is it something that you don't really need? I think it's great that this framework will be adopted because it strengthens the process. I think it's important to look at the details. I think governance is a very important issue, also in terms of reporting requirements. And a very comprehensive sustainability approach is something that will be looked at here. And I think it's great that this expanded reporting requirement will give a new dimension to the process. So this is a societal issue. We all agree on this. Now there will be a new framework from the EU from 2024. You said that we've got basically the most important tools. How do you get everyone, all the companies, not just Vilida, to observe these requirements? Well, one thing is to create binding requirements. We did this in terms of the Supply Chain Act and also through other EU instruments. And then the other thing is to create a process that is alive, and what can help here is, of course, the OECD guidelines, just to mention an example, but there are other instruments as well, for example, the UN Compact. So you've got a multi-stakeholder approach, and this can help here. You have to use the guidelines and operationalize them depending on your business activities. So standards have to be created to make sure that due diligence is observed. The guidelines, for example, have to be created for fields like artificial intelligence. And what is really important here is to get all stakeholders involved. There are round-table discussions, for example. We do this at the OECD. We invite NGOs, civil society organizations, trade unions, and other stakeholders so that these groups can get in touch with each other and consider the priorities that really matter to them. So I think a clear challenge here is that there are some larger companies such as Vilida, which have always had this sustainability criterion in their DNA, so they can pioneer this work. And then we have to look at the possibilities for larger companies to help smaller companies. Digitalization can be helpful here. For example, digital certificates can be created for certain products that a large company has developed, for example, and that smaller companies can then use because they know that certain raw material, for example, has been extracted from a trustworthy source. So this is a big challenge for small companies. And by cooperating with other companies from the same sector and other sectors, it's possible to identify risks and possibilities for action. And in this way, the entire process comes alive. And this, I think, is translated into a change, of a transformation of the overall process, irrespective of whether the requirements are binding or not. And I think this is important because it triggers a transformation in business and in society itself. Let's look at the legislation here. Ms. Trittin, do you think that what we've got in terms of the legislation, do you think it's enough? Or would you say that voluntary mechanisms are no longer needed? Well, I think that it's important to give companies leeway, to leave them a scope for action. We've heard that these challenges are very specific, and the challenges that have to be addressed by the companies are very specific. So therefore, I think it is a challenge also for legislators to create a framework that allows, that gives companies a certain leeway in order to remain competitive. And therefore, I think that voluntary commitments continue to be important. The necessary legislation is not yet there. So I think in this phase, voluntary mechanisms are important. We're still in a learning phase and in an experimentation phase. So the regulatory mechanisms may take over in the future, but especially regarding those companies that do not look at this issue, I think regulatory mechanisms will be important. Those who are pioneering this work, however, should be encouraged in their voluntary commitment, and then maybe it would not be a good thing to create too much regulation here. In the long term, I would say that some kind of regulation will be necessary. In the first panel, we talked a lot about the need for European and global solutions. We've talked about pilot projects, about pioneering companies here in the CDR initiative in terms of our European values, which are not necessarily the same as American or Chinese values. We see this in the case of data, for example. So how can we make sure that the process works to really trigger a transformation in society? I think these questions are very relevant these days as we are confronted by international crises and as we have to address new challenges. There's a rivalry of systems, which we can see at a global level. The EU's GDPR has been debated intensively in many countries, and these are very strict data protection requirements. The European single market is a market that is really able to set standards itself. And I think this is something that we in Europe decide and regulate also in the field of digitalization. And it's a process that is being emulated by others throughout the world. And I think it's certainly true that we need international agreements. We need international treaties to address these questions and regulate the digital world, because these are all global phenomena and they require global regulation. You can see this in the case of multinational corporations. So there are many issues that cannot be resolved at the national level. And it's important to make sure that consumers know what products and services they access. So they have to know what happens with their data. They have to know what kind of environments they are moving in. And we need clear regulation also of artificial intelligence. We need international standards. And I think that further treaties will reflect this. But we're still in the midst of the process. And we are pioneers. And in 2018, when we launched the process, we knew that the next decade, or perhaps the next 2 decades, would be all about learning and trying to find a course of action. So I think this is something that requires us to find a basis of values. Ms. Brandt, the OECD has a lot of multinational expertise. How is it possible? How do you go about finding international standards? Isn't this difficult, especially if you look at Asia? How do you go about reaching a compromise?
Leitlinien für multinationale Unternehmen als auch ein anderes Beispiel, aber ich würde sagen sehr.
There are successful examples, for example, multinational guidelines for multinational corporations and also taxation. There's a global minimum tax for multinational corporations. So there are some successful examples that show that it is possible to reach a compromise and to find global solutions. So perhaps we're not always like-minded community with the same values, but we do have similar interests. How did we do this? The OECD is an organization that unites, that brings together many wealthy industrialized nations, Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand, and others. And it's been possible on multiple occasions to reach a compromise within the OECD and then to try to broaden the process and to involve other countries as well. So this is one possible course of action in the multilateral context. And of course, it's very important to operationalize these standards. It's very easy to agree on very broad and general standards, but in practice, it's important to find to make these standards measurable. I think the European Union can do a lot here in terms of setting standards, in terms of ensuring data protection and data privacy. And if you're really good at something, and then this can convince others. It can also convince consumers, and in this way, one particular standard can become a new golden rule. So I think this is a continuous process. We have to talk to others. We have to talk about our values and to make sure what values have to be adhered to. In terms of corporate digital responsibility, Mr. Coon this is something that is still a concept that is only known to a minority, but how can we change this? We support raising awareness for this initiative, and I think it's very important that more companies will get involved here. Digitalization is an area that is changing our lives in a profound way, and ethical standards are of the essence. Voluntary responsibility is one thing, but I think that consumer protection and other standards that are necessary would be lost if we cannot keep up this momentum. So we have to increase the awareness and the visibility of this initiative. And we also have to show that this is something that is an added value for companies. I think this has become clear today. So I hope that more companies from Germany and elsewhere will join this initiative. Let's look at the practical side. Mr. Wössner, what is Vilida doing to ensure CDR at a global or European level? We've got a corporation-wide guideline that formulates our values, our principles, and also our responsibility. And this is a corporation-wide guideline. We have communicated this. It is a guideline that applies to everyone within the company, also at the international level. Our CDR Council also has an international membership, so this is very important for us. Our approach is to make sure that the guideline applies internationally. Our subsidiary in North America, for example, was very enthusiastic about this issue, and it said, "What are you doing about this? And what can we do what can we do here?" So this worked really well. It allowed us to internationalize the process. Do you have the impression that something has changed over the past few years regarding the implementation of the standards? Basically, I would say that greenwashing has not changed very much. What has changed, however, is that there is increasing societal awareness for this phenomenon. So consumers are generally more aware of this issue, and they are also more critical. And this makes it increasingly difficult for companies, or very risky, to recover from greenwashing if it is discovered. So this is something that has changed. And the possibility of consumers to get access to information, transparency, has also increased. So perhaps we could suggest that greenwashing is also becoming more complex and more intricate. But I think on the whole, we can say that the pressure on companies is higher, and it's easier for customers, for consumers, to question what companies are doing, to question whether they are following up on their words. Would it be reasonable, in your opinion, to better monitor these reports and also to have certificates for this? I suppose it will help companies, and it is in the interest of companies to have an independent entity that looks at their reports, because this can help to create trust. I think it is important for many consumers to know that the reports that are released have been independently verified and assessed. And also, it's important that companies show that they are translating their words into actions, and in this way, transparency is created. Ms. Brandt, it is obvious that increasingly a large number of companies are willing to engage with CDR. In the long term, will all participants be aware of the magnitude of the transformation? Well, it's difficult to tell, but I do think that companies, but also society at large, recognize that this is a very big transformation, and there's also a great deal of uncertainty. I think the main challenge here is to show up and a path forward. How can everyone benefit from the process? I think this is the main challenge. I think we all know that something is happening, but how can we shape this to the best interest of all? So what elements does future strategy need in practical terms? I think one thing that hasn't been addressed, I think we've heard about smart movers. So we often talk about lifelong learning. Our world is changing, and many jobs will not be needed anymore in the future. So this means that employees will have to learn continuously. But what this really means and how you really go about doing this is another question. For example, somebody has learned a job which is no longer needed. He will have to learn new skills. He will have to undergo further training. I think we're still at the very beginning of this process. In Germany, for example, the dual vocational training system is well established. It means that I learn a certain profession, a certain occupation, and I will stay in this job for the rest of my life. But this is no longer the case, and I think this is really a concrete element that we have to work on. At the same time, if I may add this, we have to ask ourselves, is this process getting better? It has been said that consumers are increasingly well informed, but there's another aspect to this. There's the shortage of skilled labor, which needs to be addressed, and we keep hearing this from companies. When companies commit to certain values, then it's easier to attract employees. So I think if you do it right, then the process will allow you to make progress here. So we're talking about voluntary initiatives, voluntary commitments, but will these be enough to address these very complex problems that we're facing? So we've got better informed consumers. The EU is pushing for better regulation. And who else is able to create pressure for action, Mr. Coon? Well, I think you have also touched on this in your question. It's not just regulation that we need. So I think it is certainly the case that we are in a transformation, in a digital transformation that covers all areas of life. And the disruption that we can see here can be compared to other historic times, for example, the development of the steam engine. So what we need is regulation. The policymakers and the federal government have to do something here. And we need a committed civil society that demands certain actions from policymakers. We have to address the impacts of decisions on everyday life, on people's everyday lives. And we need companies to address their responsibility beyond mere considerations for profit. So I think this will involve everyone, and also the science community, which will be able to bring their expertise into the process. So I think it's the task of everyone, and I hope we will be able to create added benefits for society, but we don't know at this point in time. So therefore, it's so important to have this debate, and the ethical framework is something that is very important because it's about people's lives, and we have to say this very clearly. So a stricter framework, is it able to create more trust and better transparency for consumers? Compared to more voluntary commitments. There's a very strong echo. I wasn't able to understand the question. Relating to what Mr. Coon has just said, would you say that that we don't actually need stricter rules and stricter regulation to generate trust? Ms. Trottin, would you like to say something here? I think regulation can only provide a minimum standard. So this is happening in many areas, and we've heard examples here. There will be a stronger reporting requirement in the field of sustainability in 2024, and I think this is good. But what we've seen from this debate is that a minimum has to be created and risks have to be minimized. But what is really important for companies is that digitalization brings enormous innovation opportunities. We're used to looking at the risks of the process, but for companies, I think digital responsibility can become attractive because it's about the opportunities. So what new markets can be accessed? How can consumers be attracted to companies? So I would agree with Mr. Coon that we have a cross-society responsibility. It involves companies and other stakeholders from society. And it means that across all areas of society, we have to work together. And there are opportunities in store for companies if they are committed to digital responsibility. So, Mr. Coon, I think you've raised your hand again. Is there something you would like to add here? Yes, I wanted to say something. We, at the Consumer Protection Ministry, supports the Center for Trustworthy AI. So in terms of artificial intelligence, it's important to set standards, and these elements will be needed also for future technologies. Technological change is happening very fast. Consumers have to be supported in this digital world. We've got instruments at the European level, but the standards are not there. The standards that we actually need are still not there. So we need to support consumers. Husband, I also wanted to add something here. So the question is, don't we need clearer rules and regulation? I think this is really something we have to think carefully about. There's such a lot of innovation in the digital world, and as Ms. Trottin has said, there are also many opportunities to develop these technologies further. We will see that there are also more risks, but this is also true for regulation and legislation. I agree with you that merely voluntary commitments won't work. Usually they won't work. But of course, legislation can also lead to effects that are not intended, that obstacles to innovation are unintended, but yet they happen. So therefore, I think that it is very important to create a space for experimentation in which voluntary commitments take place, and then companies can try to find out what opportunities they have and how risks can be minimized. And once you've got an overview of the situation, then the legislator may find some kind of regulation in order to support the process.
Mr. Wessner, how can CDR be better enshrined within companies? How to raise the awareness for the challenge it presents for society, something which can also be beneficial for companies by providing an added value? Well, I believe that if we take a purely regulatory approach and impose restrictions, this might be counterproductive and might indeed stifle innovation. Whereas on the other hand, if companies and people realize that CDR is a good thing for all parties involved and that it is really part of the mainstream production process, then CDR can really have an integrating role and impact and help all stakeholders to see the full picture, and this will also increase acceptance of CDR, because then it will not be seen as an additional requirement, but really as a benefit, as an added value, and this will help companies to embrace it more. Yes, it's a very complex matter indeed, and this brings me back to the State Secretary, Mr. Coon. How do we take the CDR from the bubble it's still in, and how do we spread the message and mainstream it, so to speak? It is an issue of relevance, similar to other issues which might also be in their bubble for the time being, but these are issues which are of such relevance to society that they will take center stage, they will become part of the mainstream, and the pioneering companies who have taken it on board already, I think they will also help us to translate the issue and to escalate it to a broader level. But I'm afraid I would have to leave the panel now because I have to rush to Parliament where we talk about legislative proposals. Right now I'm involved. Thank you. So, but that's fine because it's 12 or even 12:05 already, and that's the end of our panel. Anyhow, so I would like to thank all panelists for this extremely interesting debate we had today. Mr. Coon, you said CDR will become part of the mainstream automatically, and hopefully this will also mean that we will meet again next year for another CDR conference, which I already look forward to. Thank you very much indeed, and have a nice day, everybody.